Okay. So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you happen to be in the globe. As part of our continuing series of the middle books of the Republic, the Center for Research in Greek Philosophy is very, very happy, institutionally and personally, to introduce and have as our guest Professor McCabe. MM is a personal friend of mine, a very old friend, but above that, she is a superb scholar. She was educated at Cambridge University and Newnham College and taught there for a while. Then she became professor of philosophy at King's College, London, where she trained a number of extraordinary younger students. There is a McCabe school, actually, some people claim. She has mostly concentrated on Plato. She's written 4 books on Plato. Plato on Punishment, a very unlikely topic for you, actually, if I may say so. Plato on Individuals, Plato's predecessors on conversation, in a way, in dialogue, and finally, Plato's Conversations, along with essays on Aristotle. And even I noticed, to my suspicious nerve, the Stoics as well. You know, I was very worried about it. But in any case, tonight, she's going to talk to us about the cave. And as far as I can tell, she's asking a new question about the cave, which is very refreshing. Namely, what is it for them to be like us? Or what is for us, to be like them? And the answer is forthcoming in the next 45 or 50 minutes. Emma, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Alexander. It's wonderful to be here. As I'm not very good at social media, but I posted that I had gone down to the Piraeus this morning and nothing happened. So I'm hoping I'm going to get away with nothing happening now.
Nothing bad.
Okay, there is a handout, which is mostly coherent. There's a moment later on in it where something went pear-shaped, but I will explain it as we go along. Okay. The program of the cave in the Republic is set out from the start of Book 7, where Socrates says, "After that, I said," this is text 1, "compare our nature to some experience like this in the matter of education and its failure. This composite agenda of education and its failure contextualizes education as a process towards success or failure. To this point, I shall return. For now, just notice the careful setting of the story, text 2. You are describing a strange image," he said, "and strange prisoners. They are like us," I said. For after all, now this is very difficult to translate this next sentence, so you'll forgive the rebarbative nature of my translation. For after all, for such people, do you think they have seen anything of themselves and of each other than the shadows cast by the fire on the wall of the cave opposite? How could they have, he said, if they were compelled to have their heads unmoving throughout their lives? Socrates' remark, "like us," is usually construed as a generalization, like us humans, or like us civilized Greeks, or like us and our mates in the Piraeus, or whatever. As a generalization, one might think there's nothing personal about this first-person plural, just a device to surprise. It's used here, one might think, to talk about situations or characters that are distributed across a particular group, humans or civilized Greeks. But 2 things may suggest a richer reading than that. The first, of course, is the setting itself of the conversation between Socrates and his friends, to which group Thrasymachus eventually belongs, at the house of Cephalus, where the first person plural, us, marks out this particular fictional group doing something particular together. The second thing that might make us pause about this moment is Socrates' use of personal reflexives to explain his point. Have such people seen anything of themselves and of each other than the shadows, blah, blah, blah. He's not, I think, I hereby recant something I said once, he's not making a profound point, I think, at this stage about self-knowledge, whatever that might be, but rather insisting on the restriction in the visual fields of the prisoners as to how they're able to interact with each other within the limitations of their chains. I shall suggest that this interacting with each other is central to how we should understand the ways in which the prisoners are like us. I shall exploit the conceit of my title, Just Like Us, which doesn't appear in the text, you'll notice, to make two different proposals. The first is that the discussion of education and its failure are to be understood in terms of what it is to be us. So, just like us, or exactly like us, what it is to be us together, in which context Socrates' remark turns out to be a challenge rather than a generalization. This understanding in turn supports Glaucon's later concession that when we ask the released prisoners to return, we are asking just things of just people, an appeal to the moral character of the released prisoners that is often thought to be unsubstantiated by the argument itself. Does it matter that Socrates says that the prisoners are like us? We might think that it does. The Republic, after all, is full of us. Even from the opening pages, there's an elaborate construction of the group assembled at the house of Cephalus, to which Socrates, describing himself in the first person singular at the beginning and narrating the dialogue as I, becomes assimilated. This group is often cast in the first person plural, we in the incidental language of the dialogue, what I have called in the past the conversational we, engaged on the joint project of the conversation itself. But as I've suggested on other occasions, and this is a sort of attempt to tie up some of the loose ends of that suggestion, this first person plural, we, wanders. It may shift its reference across short passages of text from the conversational we to something far more general to describe features of ordinary human existence. So, for example, we are afraid of earthquakes, or we walk upright. Here, what I originally called the vernacular we serves to distribute characteristics across the general group. I should perhaps, now thinking about it in terms of this passage, have called it the distributive we. Our fear of earthquakes is an individual matter for each of us, not a collective phobia, apart from peculiar cases. As I suggested, this vernacular we is the usual construe of the remark about the prisoners, and as such it means little more than a distribution across us. But we also wanders in a direction far more particular to the Republic, towards what I have called the Kallipolis we, where the friends of the conversation talk of themselves as actual participants in the city they are building in words. So you might have a look, for example, I didn't put this on the handout because the handout threatened to get huge. 373E, for example, they talk about themselves as waging war. Shall we wage war? Who is going to be doing that? Right? These shifts, this wandering, sometimes takes place in quick succession, as we'll see. Well, so what? All this wandering is perfectly comprehensible. There's nothing puzzling about it. Perfectly comprehensible, both within the narrative and within the grammar of the piece. There's no problem in making sense of it. So perhaps the point is philosophically insignificant. There are, of course, those who take the narrative frame of dialogues like this to be dispensable to its philosophy. I am not one of them, and will proceed on the assumption that careful shifts in Plato's language are significant unless they're shown to be otherwise. In the case of the wandering we, I think, two things support a prima facie case for taking it seriously. The first is the way that it accompanies the motif koina ta philon, common among friends, which is both thematic and radical across the central books of the Republic. The second reason to take it seriously is the density of the wandering we at the beginning of Book 7, where the description of education and its failures is central to understanding why philosophy might matter at all. This may generate two further thoughts. First, that the conversational we gives us, the we of this actual conversation fictionalized in front of us, gives us a model for understanding the Kallipolis we, the we of the people who are apparently part of this city they're building in words. Both in conversation and in Kallipolis, we are talking about joint enterprise. Second, we may then ask, prompted by Socrates' talk about us at the start of the cave, what it is to be an us. Is it a story or a project or merely a state of affairs? How did we get that way to be us? Does it just happen? Or do we have to work at it, as Thrasymachus, for example, does? Okay, the central books of the dialogue, so the books that I think you're focused on in particular, 5, 6, and 7, are heavily structured and variously thematized in different ways. For example, Dominic Scott has been interested in longer and shorter roads to the end, for example. Two, in my view, are dominant. The first is the common among friends theme. So have a look at text 3. But everything else will be unimportant, so long as the saying goes, as they guard this one major thing, or rather, this thing is sufficient rather than great. I really want to spend some time, not now, but trying to work out why he puts it like that. That's a very weird sentence. What thing is that, he asked. Education, I said, and upbringing. For if by being well educated they become measured men, they become metrioi, then they will see all these things easily, as well as what we're missing out. The possession of women and getting married and the having of children, how all of these things must be done as far as possible in accordance with the proverb, common among friends. The other motif is the one that's more familiar, perhaps, to all of us, the motif of the three waves which threaten to overcome the argument. The first wave is, can and should women be rulers? I'll come back to what I've put on the handout in a sec. Second is, how do we have women and children in common? 457b to 472. And the third one is the one we're concerned with today, which is, how can this state, that is Kallipolis, come about by philosophers ruling, 472 to the end of Book 7. These two themes, that is to say, common among friends and the waves, are, I think, connected. For each of the three waves is cast as explaining what it would be for the city of Kallipolis to embody common among friends. One might think, again, that the three waves are just a piece of narrative structure, albeit in the service of the argument to get us to think about the processes of education, especially within a political context. But the motif common among friends, I believe, is the key to understanding them all. First of all, the expression koina ta philon sets up a basic grammatical structure of object, that is to say, ta koina, the things possessed in common, and what I shall describe as subjects, namely the possessors of those objects, the friends, the philoi. It is then a striking feature, I think, of the first two waves that they reparse that grammatical structure to produce two radical claims that might surprise us. In the first wave, the discussion of the role of women among the guardians begins with the assumptions that they, like their children, are the objects of possession. But there's very strange and highly circumscribed discussion of the philosopher queens in various different ways, including the allusions to Aristophanes, draws attention to the way that the women's role shifts from being the object to being the possessing subject. As a guardian, the philosopher queen will count as a friend, not as what is in common, as one of us, rather than as one of the things we share. That's the first move. I've put this on the handout as focuses on the grammatical subject. In the second wave, even more astonishingly, it seems to me, Socrates turns his attention to what the commonality might be, and once again explains it in terms of the subject, the philoi, the friends, who in this particular instance share an emotion or an affection. Here too, he offers a radical interpretation of common among friends, for he argues that in an ideal case, that is to say, in the ideal state, we might share emotions so far as to be the primary joint subjects of the verbs of affection, properly us. So if you have a look, 462a to b, you can see this happen, particularly, so if you remember, when he's talking about that, the idea is that if your finger hurts, it's you it hurts, not your finger, and that we should think the same way about the subjects of the verbs of affection in Kallipolis, so that the individuals don't feel the pain, it's the city as a whole that feels the pain. And that it's about the grammar of it is underpinned by the repeated interest in that passage in reflexive pronouns, in what counts as mine and what counts as ours and yours. I'm not going to talk about that more. I'm very happy to talk about that some more in discussion, but I've written about it elsewhere and I'll shut up about it now. The third wave, which is what I want to say today, which is designed to explain philosophers' ruling, is likewise characterized as common among friends, both at the end, at the summing up at the beginning of Book 8, and also in the summative passages from 531 following. That characterization, I propose, provides an interpretation of how the prisoners in the cave are indeed just like us. Notice, first of all, that the wandering we is in play right away. After the description of the image of the cave, Socrates turns to interpretation. Have a look at text 4. Looking at the bit where, no, I'm not going to, I won't, I'm just going to comment on it. I won't read it out loud because otherwise it takes too long. Notice, however, in this passage, the elaborate pronoun shifts. It starts with an impersonal, this image should be applied to. So if you have a look, prosapteon in the Greek below. This image should be, so it's impersonal at the beginning. This image should be applied to the whole of what was said before. And then it switches to the personal. And if you interpret the journey upwards and the view of the things up there as the upwards, sorry, this bad translation, isn't it? The upwards journey of the soul towards the intelligible place, you will not miss my intention. And then to a discussion of joint belief, I think so too, says Glaucon, as far as I can understand it. And indeed you are speaking very sensibly, said he. And then it culminates in a joint next step with an emphatic we, separately registered, Nehamas, at the very end of this passage. With an emphatic we which voices disagreement with an unnamed group of educationalists. There follows a claim about what the present argument signifies, calling now the reader's own attention to her assessment of what has been said. Here, we have a conversational we describing the complex relations between the parties to the dialogue that is the Republic, and emphatically developed. But now, text 5, Socrates shifts perspective. First, he announces the role that he and Glaucon must take on as founders of the city, with executive power over the citizens. In this role, they will be agents, not discussants. This is the Kallipolis we. Glaucon's role in this is strongly characterized first in terms of what he can or can't understand, and then in his own active contribution in terms of the slogan, just things of just people. To that I shall return. At first, the rule in Kallipolis is rendered impersonal as the law. Its target characterized as what is in common, there's the theme again, koinos, and as what ties the city together. Again, one of the other noticeable things about all of this section of the Republic is the extraordinary density of the sun prefixes of verbs. So that at that point, when they start to think of Glaucon and Socrates as founders of the city, that's the Kallipolis. Sorry, yes, I'm jumping. Sorry, I've missed my place. So, at first, the rule in Kallipolis is rendered impersonal as the law. Its target characterized as what is in common and as what ties the city together. But then the first person plural reappears just as soon as the question of justice arises, apparently following the motif of commonality. So even in this short passage, we can see the Kallipolis we change from founders on the outside who may design a constitution to those who end up subject to the requirements of justice by virtue of what they cause themselves, what they cause to happen in the city. The Kallipolis we involves actual moral engagement. This shift from the personal to the impersonal to the personal, from talking about law to talking about justice, using exactly the same pronominal strategy as the previous text 4, is, I suggest, made salient by the careful composition of the passage. And then, of course, it raises an immediate question: where do these norms of justice come from? I mean, this is an old question. What do you mean, we ask, just things of just people? Are they internal to the law which the founders of Kallipolis are right now constructing? If it is, why are the founders of the city subject to the norms, given that they're on the outside of the construction? Perhaps the norms of justice are universal, inside and outside the ideal city. Or perhaps they emerge, as the train of thought in text 5 suggests, from the interest in what is common and from our involvement in it. Go back to Socrates' claim that the prisoners are like us. Even if we first take it in the vernacular or distributive sense, the sequel has already enriched the role of us in the account. For the wandering we, by the time we get to these questions of justice, has given us to think about who counts as us and how. What is it to be engaged on a joint enterprise or on something, or to have something in common? The question is exemplified and emphasized by the conduct of the dialogue itself, but by now it's made more urgent by the third wave and its account of education and its failure. The framing of the story of the cave by the wandering we and the running motif common among friends invites, I shall suggest, two connected questions as a consequence of Socrates' initial like us. The first question is, what does that mean? It's a question I sort of figured at the beginning. What does any of this have to do with this really interesting Platonic epistemology that we're about to get? How does any of this connect to the epistemology that's developed in the cave and its sequel? And what is more, what does any of that, especially epistemology, have to do with justice? What claim does justice make on the citizens of Kallipolis and on us who are founding it from the outside? Okay, start with the questions of epistemology. It's a natural assumption in a post-Cartesian era to suppose that knowledge is explained in terms of the first person singular, at least in the primary case. This is often, of course, thought to be the only way to respond to skepticism and the only way to build a warrantable epistemology. It's the only way to do it, but it's very dull. So I didn't write that down, I just said it. It rests often on an assumption that epistemology needs to be foundational on something like singular events of justified true belief or something like that, and supposes that any account of knowledge that is broader in scope will collapse without those foundational elements. And this is the power of the Gettier puzzles. For anybody who's interested in Gettier, I recommend the wonderful paper by Tamar Gendler and John Hawthorne on fake barns, which makes all the stuff about fake barns and the Gettier example in epistemology absolutely hilarious, instead of being upsetting. Because I never understood there were places that had fake barns, but I still don't think there are any. It's Tamar Gendler, Gendler, and John Hawthorne, spelt with an E, and I can't remember the name of the paper. But if you Google those two, it was written in the last few years. It's not old. That's right, isn't it? You don't know. It's hilarious. It's worth reading because actually it's funny and philosophy. What more can you ask? Okay, so go back to justified true belief and epistemology being foundational. Should we think that Plato or Aristotle even shares those kinds of assumptions, the post-Cartesian assumptions? Is the role of the journey of the prisoner out of the cave exactly to discover such foundational truths? Is the education of the prisoner about finding certitude and then being done? What are we to say of the suggestions in the later account that the escaped prisoner might be capable or brave, that he might have all sorts of characteristics that don't seem to have anything to do with what you might find if you're sitting in your armchair worrying about demons? Reflection, however, on the wandering we in the cave might suggest an approach to knowledge which doesn't look like that at all, but rests instead on the centrality of explanation, where that is contextualized here in terms of giving and taking an account, and where the importance of the knowing subject parses knowledge as the capacity to understand, the capacity of the subject, not merely an account of knowledge's objects. Another footnote, sometimes we get overexcited, it seems to me, by what looks like a kind of hyper-realism in the Republic. We go, oh my God, that must be all there is to it all. But what I'm suggesting is that all of this interest in the subjects of knowledge really undermines that hyper-realist approach to epistemology. Such an approach to knowledge may not, after all, imitate Cartesian solipsism, and it may not even be constructed in simply foundationalist terms. Don't deny that there's some realism going on. Instead, I shall suggest we need to understand it as a process towards epistemic virtue, where that process is fundamentally a joint enterprise. Text 1, after all, describes not a state of affairs, but some processes, because otherwise you wouldn't get the stuff about failure. The story that follows is designed to explain becoming knowledgeable, becoming wise, coming to understand, or failing. It's an explanation that's framed from the outset in terms of more than one person. Text 2 again. Text 2 describes each prisoner's apprehension of them all, and this will matter in what follows. Then the plural, oneself and each other and us, is explained what follows not, as I suggested earlier, not in terms of self-knowledge, but rather in terms of the parity of the situation for all of the prisoners in identifying who is who on the wall in front of them. Then that plural goes all the way through the cave, describing as it does the joint activities of the world represented. It starts, of course, in a conversation, that is to say, the conversation between Socrates and Glaucon, imagining another one. For the city, but the city thus imagined, conversation between the prisoners, is one where solipsism is markedly absent. They compete and admire and award prizes and praise. The conversations between each other are essential for all of this activity. So have a look at text 6, which comes in a bit later on, but you can see why you need to know from the start how it is that any of the talk that happens, that's described in the early stages of the cave, has got a recipient. You're not just sort of sitting there like that by yourself. The prisoner's release and his journey upwards is heavily populated as well. Of course, there needs to be someone who can release him, but more significantly, whoever that someone is going to talk to him. She's going to ask him questions and expect answers and continue pestering him right the way upstairs. So this is to explain the bits that went adrift in text 7, because what I've tried to do is to allow us to there's a sort of square brackets 4 lines down, which I didn't mean to leave in there, but what I'm trying to do is to use the different genders in order to be able to see who's who. So there are emphatically 2 people who said this, the asking the question, and there's the letting him go, and there's the, wait a minute, you haven't answered my question. Why are you turning around? What is it that you're thinking about? Why you might go back and sit down in your chained up place again? Then so this is what Socrates says. Then if someone told him that he saw trivial things, but was now turned decisively towards what is and to the things that are more real, he sees better. And if showing him each one of the things going past, she were to compel him with questions to answer what it is, don't you think that then he would be at a loss? And he would think the things he saw then are more true than what is shown now. Very much so, he said. And don't you think that if she compelled him, it's personal that bit, I've translated it wrong, to look towards the light itself, his eyes would hurt and he would turn towards those things he could see. 7. And run away and would judge those things to be in fact clearer than the ones he was now being shown. That's right, he said. Well then, if someone dragged him by force up through the harsh and steep road upwards and didn't let him go until she dragged him into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be pained and resent being thus dragged upwards? This process of education is itself joint enterprise. The prisoners can't release themselves, nor would they, given the attractions of where they originally were. Thereafter, they're engaged all along in a conversation, in a discussion about the things he sees and what she tells him they actually are. Does this commonality recede when the prisoner emerges? Is he to stand alone, seeing all by himself? She's sort of bumbling about, asking all these questions, and he goes, suddenly he's free, stands alone, seeing all by himself the real objects in the real world outside the cave. That this is solitary is suggested, many suppose, by the model of perception that dominates the story of the cave. Perception, we might think, is bound to be individual, not collective, and given a realist account, moreover, to be determined by its objects, not its subject. Just as the body's eye is turned to the real physical objects, so it's thought the eye of the soul is turned to the forms, and the possessor of the eye sees all by himself. His spelunker companion is left by herself within. An initial caveat, of course, this is an extended image, as Socrates insists. We shouldn't be too swift to suppose that the language of perception that belongs to the image carries directly over into how we should understand the epistemology described by the eye of the soul and its capacity. But even as an image, it's already loaded by what has happened already, in particular by three different moves. First of all, the earlier discussions of knowledge, especially in Book 5, don't suppose that perception is a raw function. That is to say, the reason that hyperrealism is as if there's some stuff there and it smacks you between the eyes, and that's what knowing looks like. That doesn't fit the extraordinarily complicated ways in which the earlier books, actually from Book 4 onwards, describe the ways in which perception is educated. It's not that perception is just a raw feel. Perception is something much richer and articulate and, what's the right word? Rich is probably the best way to put it. It's much more heavily cognitive than we often assume when we think about this passage. So that's the first thought. So here too, I think, the account is dominated, and there is a lot of fuss about what we are talking about when we talk about perception. The stuff about the eye of the soul is designed to do that. The account is dominated not so much by the objects of perception, but by its capacities and how they may be improved. This is anticipated at the end of Book 6 in a very interesting passage there at 505. On this account, perception can be educated as in just the way that we might think of the eye being turned towards the real things outside the cave, and the same is true of the eye of the soul. But that education of perception, it doesn't happen just by, this is the point about the eye of the soul, it doesn't happen just by you turning yourself around. It's already collaborative. It's already informed by somebody else. Oh, you think that's a building over there, but actually it's a Magritte illusion. Those kinds of conversations are the conversations, I think, that not the Magritte bit, but you'd have liked Magritte all the same. Okay. So it's all, I say, done in collaboration. The eye of the soul is turned along with the whole soul. Secondly, these images take the process to be a continuous one, teleologically explained. So you can see that in the recapitulation at the end of Book 7. It's entirely appropriate here that we're talking about education and its failure. The prisoner may in the end retreat backwards, just as some of the more promising characters of the later books deteriorate. Or the prisoner may succeed. And if he does, what he ends up doing seems to be continuous with what he's done before. His developed, educated state is one which has become capable of seeing and contemplating the clearest things of all. You might compare the discussion of dunamis in Book 5. None of this makes it anti-realist, but the understanding of what is real is a matter for the subject's capacity. His educator has the skill to turn him around. She's the one who's able to develop his capacity. And she does so because the virtues of thought rest on innate human powers, so that she doesn't create the capacity to see, but rather renders it functional. How is that to be done? What is it to educate, or for education to fail? What is the significance of the release of the prisoner in terms of the world of Kallipolis, for which education needs to be modelled? In the later pages of Book 7, Socrates starts to explain education in terms of common among friends, where the dominant idea is giving and taking an account, characterized here as dialectic, text 8. I think indeed, said I, that the root of all these things we've discussed already, if it arrives at the point where they are in a community, that's a koinonia with each other, and a relationship together, syngeneia, and if it generates, I guess my point about the syn prefix is easily made, the conclusion that they are akin to each other, then it contributes to our project and is not pointless, otherwise it is. I would say that too, but you're talking of a huge project, Socrates. Are you talking of the prelude, I asked, or what? Don't we know that all these things are preludes to the main theme? Nomos, I think that's a joke. With the passage earlier on where he talks about the law and uses the same expression. Sorry, that's a footnote, but it might be interesting to think about that. Don't we know that all these things are preludes to the main theme that needs to be understood? For I suppose people who are smart at these things won't seem to you to be dialecticians. Nobody's use, apart from a few I have met. But I said, do you think we could ever say of those who are unable to give nor take an account that they know any of the things we say they should? What is the significance of this shift to what seems to be a technicality, the talk of dialecticians? And what is it for them to give and take an account? It's, of course, a commonplace to think that this is an extra textual point, where you go, yeah, we all know, because this is part of the deal. If you're doing Socrates and Plato, we all know that it's all about dialectic, which is something quite different from giving and taking an account in the normal sense of the word. Notice, first of all, that this is set up in the context of the language of common among friends. You can see it again at 343a, at the beginning of the text, the beginning of book 8. Notice, second of all, that the dialectic epithet is anticipated, and I've argued this in detail before, that one of the things that the Republic does is create from a model of conversation something that is a more rarefied version of it, but still has its roots in conversation. And my argument there was that actually this work is designed to christen the expression dialectic rather than simply to import it from outside. So the dialectic epithet is anticipated and developed directly and with care from its roots in conversation. We shouldn't think, without good reason at least, that the talk of dialectic now simply imports a different context from outside the dialogue, nor a term of art here dissociated from its conversational roots. Keep bearing in mind that it is a process of cognitive improvement which develops this particular capacity of dialectic, giving and taking an account. But the business of dialectic is here strikingly contextualized by Glaucon's response in the same vocabulary of giving an account. I would say that too. The conversational we, the we of Socrates and Glaucon, works in the same way as the educational processes of Kallipolis in terms of giving and taking an account. I suggest then that the process of epistemic development has at first pass two significant features. The first is that it's embedded in the ordinary commonality of conversation. The second is that it preserves that commonality in the description of the perfected power, giving and taking an account. The common feature of conversation and dialectic, giving and taking an account, explains the epistemology of the cave. And indeed, if we look back at the original story, that seems confirmed. One of the repeated features of the release is the incapacity of the prisoner either to answer the questions asked of him or to accept from his interlocutor that things are otherwise than he thinks. He cannot take an account from her. Reflect on this a little more. Inside the cave, the prisoner's interlocutor is not believed, and her account that things are otherwise is not accepted. That isn't merely a question of whether what she says is true. That's taken for granted that she says something true. It's also a question of how her account is received. The modern idiom might say that she suffers, the spelunker companion, as I called her, she suffers vis-a-vis the prisoner from epistemic injustice. Her account is not heard. It's not taken seriously. Some part of taking an account, that is to say, is the recognition of the person offering it. And this fits neatly with the idea that Socrates expresses, that in developing the capacity to give and take an account, we are enhancing the commonality. Once again, the focus is not merely on the content of what is said or known or held in common, so not read only as an object, but also on the subject, who says, knows, communicates, gives, and takes. Part of the theme of common among friends is rendered by the taking seriously the point of view of another. The expression give and take an account is very rarely scrutinized, and I think we need to. This, we might further say, in the adaptation of the modern idiom, is a position of epistemic justice, which is what the proper taking of an account might require. That is to say, if you can give your own account and you expect somebody else to take it, then you've got to be able to hear theirs. And that's a situation of epistemic justice. If this is how we should understand the notion of giving and taking an account, that it is embedded in the preceding elaboration of the subjects in the maxim common among friends, then it provides, I propose, a significant role for the first person plural, for we, in parsing the language of knowledge. Is that a defensible epistemological position? And is it defensible for Plato? Again, if we think of knowledge as something like justified true belief, it's hard to see how the commonality of giving and taking an account would be at all significant, unless what is common somehow contributes to the power of justification. You know, if you think about Sosa's reliabilism, for example, it's very thin to be underpinned by something like giving and taking an account. But we might rather think that the epistemology of the Republic rejects the suggestions about true belief suggested in the Meno, for example, moving rather towards the idea that knowledge is the capacity to understand, not limited to individual true beliefs, but extended across a field. This might allow us to understand knowledge as a power, even as a virtue. It might even explain its factiveness. But what does it have to do with us? Does a requirement of epistemic justice, or a stipulation that knowledge or understanding have the commonality of giving and taking an account, help us to understand what it is to understand? For Plato, there's more to worry about. If for Plato, as it's commonly supposed, it is criterial for knowledge that there is some kind of knowledge of ideal reality, whatever we might think that be, whatever we might think that would be, why should that have anything to do with the social aspect of common among friends? Once we start to talk about epistemology, the whole thing starts to pull apart. Once again, I think the response here should be made in terms of the processes of education and its failure that is the headline of this part of the Republic. The processes are part of the commonality, and they are processes of learning in common, improving one's cognitive power in ways that embody various of the epistemic sub-virtues that are needed for the dialectical processes outlined later in Book 7. The ends of the processes, thus, I say, are continuous with how they occurred. So if giving and taking an account is a part of how education takes place, then it will indeed, and not surprisingly, be a feature of its putative end. The end will be a complete faculty to understand, and understanding will fail if its claims are falsified, but the operation of understanding is founded on the commonality of giving and taking an account, the commonality that the Republic thematizes from the very beginning. Remember, the spelunker companion. She is not, on that account, left behind. That means, I think, that the companions in the cave and the people who ascend from the cave are indeed just like us. But it doesn't quite tell us about whether they're just like us. The notions of epistemic justice and injustice, as I just located them in the dialectical giving and taking an account, are inadequate as they stand, equally in the context of contemporary social epistemology, to explain the defense both Socrates and Glaucon make of the return of the released prisoners to the cave. Because the Kallipolis we asks just things of just persons. For that appeal, just things of just persons, is firmly located in ethical and political structure, whereas the notion of epistemic justice in giving and taking an account is circumscribed by its epistemic context. What's the connection between justice of the epistemic kind and its political counterpart? Someone might plausibly argue, after all, that epistemic so qualifies the justice concerned that it's, as it were, an alienans qualification. It's not really justice at all. It's just a sort of epistemic thingy that looks like justice. Someone else might argue that this notion has no strong ethical claims on the founders of Kallipolis, based as it is on contemporary accounts of the rights of individual humans to be heard. To put this question again, how does the establishment of Kallipolis, by means of the dialectical ascent of the philosopher from the cave, in itself engender political or ethical norms, as Socrates and Glaucon seem to agree? Not long, but I'll be quick. To answer this question, we should, I think, return to the place where I began, with the first person plural and common among friends. I've suggested that the Republic is replete with the first person plural in various different and critically aligned contexts. In the course of this development, of this rich notion of us, Plato adumbrates it in terms of common among friends. That in turn develops three, as I say, striking locations for the first person plural. First, in the first wave, to include among the primary citizens of Kallipolis some who might otherwise have been seen as mere chattels. Second, to show how verbs of affection and emotion can properly be used in the first person plural, and that indeed is the best case, at least in Kallipolis. And third, to show how the vital processes of education in Kallipolis are irreducibly plural, because they depend ultimately on the centrality to understanding of giving and taking an account, a notion which has inevitably a plural subject. But then, further reflection on the story of the cave may give us the last move, I think. For there the ordinary life of the prisoners is construed in a social life in which they are initially mistaken about who is who, as Socrates insists. And that social life is inextricably political. Notice four distinct features of the story of the cave, each of them connected to the epistemic project, and each of them undeniably political. First, text 6, the life of the chained prisoners is taken up with a series of competitions. for which they strive against each other. The terms of those competitions have the politics written in. When the first word of the sentence is timai, we're already talking politics, right? So the rewards may cash out as political credit or power, and the failures as social failure and liability to political sanction. This is a state, even if it's a state that functions poorly, and as such its values are themselves political. Secondly, the description of the hurly-burly of ordinary life within the cave state is after all familiar, at least from some of Plato's other descriptions. The released prisoner is confronted with insistent questions just as if he had met Socrates. He's completely fuddled about practical matters, just like Socrates. And on his return, he's feared and hated, even so far as being sentenced to death, just like Socrates. Socrates, of course, is embarked on an epistemic project about how we may come to understand anything at all. But that project is essentially located within the social context of the city. This isn't merely an epistemic we, but a common or garden civic one. Third, the conception of giving and taking an account is itself political in tone. It was a commonplace of Athenian democratic accountability that incoming office holders would be scrutinised, and that on leaving office, they would be required to give an account of what they'd done. Failure, in turn, could result in judicial process. Accountability is not merely about defending my position against disagreement, but it can be about saving my political and even my actual life. But there is more, for the role of taking the account is important, for it admits to office or accepts on leaving office the person who offers it. The giving and taking of an account describes a single, complex political process. And it's not just about the account, but about who gives it. The conclusion of acceptance is admission, and the role of us sets the scene for accountability and describes its outcome in terms of common among friends. It's worth noticing, incidentally, something I discovered only recently. If you look at the two passages in Thucydides that I put on the handout, which I just made references to in the handout, the political expression dokimasia doesn't, as I've always thought, stupidly come from dokein, but from dekamai. It's an acceptance word. So it's already got the political heft built in. Fourth, recall the Kallipolis we and its deployment in text 5, where Socrates shifts readily between talking about the founders of Kallipolis, the law, and the two discussants themselves. Here, the joint enterprise on which they are engaged is not detachedly intellectual, nor merely epistemic. Instead, the Kallipolis we may not only instantiate the law, but also be subject to it, once fully absorbed into the city. In that context, we shouldn't suppose that dialectic is merely abstract, nor separate from the ordinary ways of going about one's political business. There is no reason to take Plato to be dividing the intellectual from the moral virtues, as Aristotle subsequently did, much to the damage of the more recent take-up of Aristotelian accounts of virtue. Plato had good reason, if I'm right about the cave, not to make the divorce that Aristotle subsequently makes. The business of intellectual engagement in the cave begins with who can answer the questions about what comes next in the shadow play, but the victor is socially and politically successful by virtue of being a mnemonic adept. The questions and answers that beset the released prisoner affect how he lives and dies. They're a matter for him of understanding the world about him, rather than sitting in his armchair contemplating the eternal verities. And his epistemic character is one of understanding, where that includes taking seriously the views of those with whom he shares the city, the we among whom he has developed and eventually succeeded. It's not divorced from, his social and political circumstances. When he's asked to take an account, he's required to proceed in ways that include his interlocutor as part of a joint enterprise. And as such, he's subject to the demands of justice proper to his approach, justice proper in his approach to education. The appeal to justice is, after all, built into the social dimension of the Platonic account of knowledge, so that the assumption that those who have been educated are just turns out, I propose, to be well-founded. Thank you.
Ma'am, thank you very much. I think you've provoked questions, and I will actually defer to Thanassis to do this, because he has a view of the Zoom people, and you might as well do it yourself. I will have some questions perhaps, but I'll leave them until later. And I will simply thank you and open the discussion now. So let's see if anybody here would have a question to begin with in the room.
If you do the participants, open them.
Sorry, I have to make Xanthippe.
Go ahead.
I cannot find it.
I don't understand this thing. I understand that thing.
Here we are.
There they are.
Yeah. So, ask Xanthippe.
Usually it comes at the top.
Yeah. Apologize for this.
That's all right.
Here is next basics. Sorry. Have to find. You are as KF, right, Xanthippe?
Where is Kiev? Here
So
is
we're
the
in-
X should be
We are in K, right?
missing.
Are we in? Did you say we're in the cave? Is that what you said?
Of course we are.
Yes. No.
In a sense, we are. What is my
I can see Ben and I can see William.
Yes. Yourself co-host. Okay, so let us do it otherwise. Let us
I can
unmute
see.
everyone and
Here, yes. Right.
Unmute everyone. That's going to be fun.
yeah, that's gonna be fun. For us,
Yeah.
You yourself co-host if you can see yourself there.
Can I make
Yes. Now, make co-host. So, here. So, yeah, yes. Nice. So now we're so yeah. Okay, apologize for this delay. So we can proceed to the question. As usually, I will alternate between Zoom participants and the attendees here in Athens. So let us first begin with William Altman.
Thank you very much. So, I want to ask you about your text 5. And more specifically, I want to ask you about the portion of the passage that is your text 5 that has been deleted by your ellipsis. And if anyone, including you, are interested, I have uploaded into the chat the passage in Greek between 520 B1 and 520 D6 that you did not include in your text 5. So if you'd be kind enough to look at that for a minute, I've got some questions about it.
I'm just trying to find it, which one it is. Oh, right.
Which is it? Which text are you talking about?
Text 5.
No, but I mean, which is the
So-
part that you've uploaded on the?
I put a response to the prisoners in the chat.
I can't see that because I can't, but it's the bit that I've missed out. at
Right, but I mean, if you go to
5:20,
your
right?
computer and go to the chat.
It's this bit that you're worrying about me.
Right, I am.
I just
Good.
thought it was too long.
Okay, well, so let me just say a few words about the passage, Since it includes the words hemin and humin together,
Yeah,
and another phrase, humas demes humin te autos, it seems to me that it was incumbent on you to consider that in the context of both the wandering we and the koinata ton philon, because there really is no we without you or you without we. They're conjoint terms. And what I would like to suggest, now referring to the beginning of the passage, is that there is a wandering you that I would like to ask you about, perhaps as the counterpart or an alternative to your wandering we. Because, of course, what happens in this passage that you didn't include is that a justification for compelling the guardians to go back down into the cave is given by saying that those that emerge as philosophical types in other cities, they don't need to do that. They don't know anybody, their upbringing, they don't know anybody for their ta trophea, as he calls it, but you, he says. And when he says that, but you, it seems to me this is very crucial to the passage. I mean, maybe it's just because in my interpretation of the Republic, the single most important word in the Republic, katabateon, is part of the passage that you have elided. But it seems to me that it was incumbent on you to consider not just the wandering we or the use of we, but the concomitant use of you. And notice that there are 4 uses of we and 5 uses of you, including the verbs, in this passage that falls prey to ellipsis. So I guess that, the polemical question would be something like, why did you delete it? But I suppose you're just going to say, because I didn't have room and didn't really want to include it. But so then I guess I'll shift that to say, what do you think of the idea then that the humas dei, the wandering you, as I'm called it, is either the Kallipolis you, in other words, the rebellious gardens corresponding to the Kallipolis way, or also possibly you, the reader? That's what I want to ask you about. The wandering you in the elided passage.
thanks very much, William. That's very helpful. So the description of the Kallipolis we is built into its shiftiness, right? So it's wherever it turns up, it starts by objectivizing or alienating the people in Kallipolis, the people to whom we might talk here, and then it moves in the odd feature of it is that it moves in and out of context. So sometimes it describes what they're doing on the outside, qua founders of the city. Sometimes they get kind of leached inside. And one of the difficulties about the question about justice is to whom does the requirement that we ask just things of just people, to whom does that apply? Does it apply to the people who are inventing the city, or does it apply to the people who are inside the city, or what? And it's somehow or other both. I think that he's always trying to get us to look at pronouns. So yes, I agree with you. When there are pronouns juxtaposed, it's always ostentatious. when does it make the reader surprised? Well, that goes on all the way through the Republic. If you think about, my best case is in Book 9, where we talk about the sons of Aristo, and then there's that mad line about the number of the factor by which the philosopher's life is happier than the life of the tyrant. I think all of the moments when you get Plato offering something that's supposed to be either funny, which I like those bits. You're claiming that what applies also to who Plato calls you?
The two alternatives that you just gave, in other words, the Kallipolis and the
that's, it's true that one of the funny things about pronouns is that they shift their reference all the time and that you can play with it. It's of less importance, I submit, how we think about the second person plural if we haven't cracked the first person plural. And the surprise that I'm offering you is an epistemology that comes in a first person plural. That's the thought. So sure, the second person plural definitely is going to wander, yes. And I appreciate your pointing it out. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's also true that the reader comes into view over and over again. But how weird is it from a contemporary perspective to be talking about knowledge in the plural, in a non-distributive sense? That's strange. That's really challenging, and that's why it's so exciting. That's the thought. So that it's not so problematic with the second person.
Okay, thank you. I see no hands here yet in Athens. So next question will be from Ben Morrison.
Hey,
Hi
Ben.
there. Hey, MM, how are you?
Good, thank you.
So I want to ask about your text 2, which is like the central text, the text where where homoious hemin is actually said. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about what comes either side of it. So on the one hand, it's Socrates' correction of Glaucon's suggestion that the prisoners are atopous. So I wonder if you can say a bit more about what you understand by atopous. And on the other hand, there's a whole gar clause afterwards, which is supposed to make good on the claim or sort of give a justification or whatever for the claim that they're like a sick. I'm wondering if you can just fill in a bit your story to cover the two sides of this, what comes on two sides. So how this response, what atopous means here, such that this response is, corrects it, and also how the gar clause does the explaining it's supposed to do, on your view.
Brilliant, thank you. So the atopos really interests me. So here are some first thoughts about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I'm not sure that I've got a definitive response, but there's something weird, isn't there, about using a word for weird that alludes to a particularly what's the right word? A visual, localized scenario, right? So the topos stuff surely does work to make us think it's a strange place that we're being asked to think about, and then no, it's not as strange as we thought it was because we're inhabiting it. That would be my first move, that it's about, that the idiom, the atopos idiom hasn't died. So it's meant to give us the stuff about place very vividly, especially with the repetition. That'd be that's what I think about that. I don't know whether that's enough. So the gar clause, I agree with you. Somehow or other, the gar clause is, I don't think it explains, it's designed to explain the homoious, right? They're homoioi because they haven't seen each other, themselves or each other. I mean, so you have to think about it. This is something I have thought about a lot, is that what do they actually see? Well, it isn't that, if I'm sitting here next door to Alexander and we're in the cave, I've never seen Alexander himself. All I can see is his reflection on the wall, and the same of me. And I have long argued that I don't want to call it alienation. I want to call it sort of distancing. So the puzzle about my parsing my own self-attributions is that when I attribute something to myself, I'm attributing it to that, not this. There's something oddly emptying of what we think must be sitting in the Cartesian armchair. Right, so it's shoved onto the wall. Does that go some way to answering your question? I mean, it's,
yeah. Can I have just a quick
press.
follow-up about atopos?
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether it's relevant that what Socrates says corrects the atopous going with desmotas. He says, no, it's not they are not atopous, they are like us. But he doesn't correct the atopon that goes with akona.
Sorry, Alexander was heckling from here.
I just said you took my point away.
Explain me the point again.
That homoious hermin is a correction of Glaucon's atopus, right? But it isn't, Socrates doesn't correct the atopon akona. He seems to be happy to accept that it's an atopon akona. But he says, but the prisoners, they're not atopus, they are just like us, and here's the reason why. So, does that make sense?
Yes, I do. I see that. I'm just thinking about it. I mean, I think I've always taken it that once you correct the second, you correct the first, but that may be a mistake. I mean, the run of thought I was taking to be, it's a weird acone, and they're weird prisoners. Possibly the and giving us some exegesis, I'm not sure. It's a weird image because they're weird desmotas. I'm not sure about that. But that the homoious hemin would then allow you to, at least to mitigate the placelessness of the desmotas, and then backwards to mitigate the placelessness of the acone. But I quite see that it might be much more interesting than that. What would you do with it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe something like, the kind of place I'm describing may be weird, but the people in it, they're just like us.
Oh, okay.
That's just a first shot, but I hadn't thought about it either.
Yeah.
It just, I think
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that so somehow or other what happens is that the atopon eikona just stands and keeps us worrying about it. This is Alexander's worry too.
No,
Do you
no.
want to join in on this?
Yes, I would like to join in. I think that what happens in the rest of the image renders the image less atopon, right?
Yes.
So it doesn't have to be immediately. The first thing is
Oh, okay.
we are,
okay.
and then when you hear
Okay.
all the crazy ideas that is going to give you, then you say, oh, well, yeah, that's very crazy, but it's not atopon anymore.
Well, that's
You know,
interesting.
something like that.
And it might be, okay, I like that. So, as it were, the first atopon is proleptic of the whole of the rest of it. The second one is dealt with, but the prolepsis is still sort of hanging. And especially it's still hanging until we get something about place, because all that we have in what follows is about the place itself and the way the place is set up, and it's got a, you know, I mean, we've had a bit about it, but there's a whole lot more about how the place constrains and affects the people who are in it. So that would be really nice that by the time, you know, we're supposed to have forgotten, as it were, or keep on hold the atopon eikona until we get to sort of 519, by which time we've got a better sense of it. I like that very much. I like that very much. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now going back to Athens, and the next question is from Stelios Bourlogianni.
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to ask you about text 8 and the part about page 5, text 8, at the end.
I'm here. I've got it. No, I found it. I found it here. It is. Yeah. Okay.
So page 5, text 8,
Yes.
at the bottom, there's the part about giving and taking an account.
Yes.
I looked up the text. There's a point. There's a reference to mathematicians being the smart people who are smart at these things. In the text, there's a reference to mathematicians. Do you really believe that mathematicians are good at dialectics? And so there's also an emphasis there, δεινή διαλεκτική, meaning very keen, very able in dialectics. By God, by Zeus, no way. My question is, remember the part where he says that we mustn't teach dialectics to men very early because they behave like puppies. They just fight each other without knowing what they're doing. If giving and taking an account is so important for their education, then the strange thing is it comes last. It is the last art to be taught. Dialecticians, dialectic is put aside at the summit of their education. They begin with, I don't remember the order, but it's gymnastics, music, astronomy, then mathematics, and at the end, dialectics, in the sense that if we do it too early, it will become an heuristic, and puppies who don't know what they're doing, they just bite and struggle with each other. So the strange thing is, and this is my question, it seems that we must have it very, very early, because ta ton philon kina, because people in community and communion need to share and educate them by discussing to each other, therefore giving and taking in an account. And on the other hand, we teach them that at the end of, after 30 years old. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really good question. And I think what it captures is one of the tensions, as it seems to me, between the way that Plato builds up an account of education that looks as if it's stepwise, from an equally dominant account in the work as a whole of the idea of explanation and accountability. And I think the answer to it is actually, I mean, it's true, of course, that at this point in Book 7, he says, well, you know, they're not dialecticians yet. Then do we call somebody a dialectician who's not able to give and take an account? I think my response to that is that the idea of accountability is normative. So you get, it isn't just that any doing of question and answer is doing it right, but because it's normative, it's trying to do it right all the time, but you don't actually get to the right way of doing it, which is actually to operate in full collaboration with the other person until you know what you're doing. I think that's my answer to it. I think that if you look at the earlier discussions of the way that he describes dialegesthai and dialect into his discussions of, via the notion of dialegesthai dunamis, for example, at the end of Book 5, or the end of Book 6, but you see him elaborating this idea of something that looks kind of boring and ordinary to a normative condition on proper understanding. So that doesn't help. You're not happy with that. I mean, I think that the idea would be the process has.
I think you're right. It is normative.
Yes.
Because otherwise they can't be rulers. They have to be able. They have to be able to give an account. Accountability. You said accountability is about power. When you have power, you are accountable for it. So therefore, I agree with you. It is normative. The paradox is you need it early and you need it at the end. Is it the same?
So that's what I mean by, I don't mean quite the same thing by normativity. I mean that what you're doing is you're trying to do it better. That's what I mean by it. So that what's going on is that this question and answer that you get when you're having a conversation with Socrates, that you get when you're, it's just getting better. And there is a threshold, I take it, where you're doing it, I hesitate to say this because I think the threshold is an impossible one, where you're doing it right. I think it's practically an impossible threshold, but were we to think about what we thought understanding would be, it would be that.
That's the normative part.
That's the normative. Right. Well, the normative part is also the trying, right? So it means that it grades up. The weird thing about it is that when you're, the thing that's peculiar to this description of it is that even when you've got there, it's still communal. That seems to me to be astonishing. And I think that's, I think it's really interesting. I think it means that he doesn't think it's trivial that the stories he represents are conversational, and he doesn't think that it's trivial that he every so often uses devices to, I mean, this goes back to something that William was saying earlier on, he uses devices to call attention to the relation between the author and the reader. All of those things seem to me to fit together if he has this joint enterprise conception of knowledge. Does that make sense? Are you happy
Okay.
with
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Next question is from Gail Fine.
Hey, Gail.
Hi,
How
MM.
are you
Nice to
doing?
Okay, thank you for your paper. I had a question sort of more just about the more purely epistemological suggestions. So I completely agree and like a lot of the stuff you said about perception and how that can be educated. And so you don't just look at something and see everything there is to see in it. And similarly with knowledge, you don't just look at some object and see it. I agree with all of that. But I was wondering, but you wanted to, I would like to distinguish between how we come to know something and what knowledge itself actually consists in more than you do. So I would say that what we know for Plato typically is, you know, some extra mental object. And so it's a totally realistic conception of the objects of knowledge. We don't create them in any sense, and they're not mentally dependent and so on. How we come to know them is another question. So I wasn't quite sure always of how you were opposing what you called hyperrealism from knowledge. Because I would want to say the stuff about educating and going through dialectic and talking with others, that's a method you use by which you eventually come to be in the state of knowing, and how we describe that state when you're in it and what it's of, that's a separate thing.
So one of the ways perhaps of thinking about this, and I think the difference between us may partly be a matter of language. Supposing one's thinking about scientific understanding, what would it like to be a scientific understander? And one view would be that being a scientific understander is being a member of a community that understands science, where it's, for sure, it's realist. You don't need to be an anti-realist to be a scientist. But you do need to be part of a community that has learned, I mean, in the case of science, you learn to depend on others. So this is a different version of it, I think, because Plato doesn't have that sort of model in mind. I think that it's true of the scientist that when we say of the scientist that the scientist understands this bacterium, that there is a bacterium such that they understand it. So the realism, I think, is essential to all of this, especially since it looks in Plato like scientific understanding. But if one thinks about it as understanding rather than anything else, I think it makes it easier to think of the process as one where the process and the end are continuous and where the process can be a joint activity. But I don't know, I mean, that may be just that I've just moved the goalposts in ways you'd rather I didn't do.
No, I mean, you distinguish the process and the end point there. So, I mean, there's the process, and maybe you can make progress only, well, I might want to say best, and you would want to say only with others. But where it ends up when you count as having achieved knowledge or understanding, what we take the content of that to be.
But then,
is the one that matters.
Okay, right. So that's my problem, right? So if I think that I'm doing all this question and answer, and I'm working my way up the ladder or up the way out of the cave or whatever it is, and then I emerge at the top able to know the external realities. What does that have to do with the condition he insistently puts that what we're looking at here is the ability to give and take an account? That's the problem where I begin. And incidentally, I think I suddenly realized, having been thinking about this stuff in the Republic, then I was thinking about the Theaetetus. At the end of the dream, he makes the same move. He's talking about logos, and it looks as if it's kind of piecemeal. And then suddenly he says, yeah, but unless somebody can give and take an account, we're not going to say they know. But then we have to be able to say something more than what I was caricaturing as hyperrealism, which is not your view at all, but there are people who think it's kind of, oh Christ, form of the good, smack, that thing.
No, we're at one on that.
We're at one about that, aren't we? Yeah.
Yes.
Does that answer a bit?
Well, we're at one on the stuff about not just looking at something and seeing it. And I think the stuff about giving and taking account is you have to be able to explain. You don't have knowledge if you can't lay it out, if you can't articulate it.
But taking. He always says, he doesn't always say, but he mostly says, and he does it in the Theaetetus again, giving and taking. What's that about? It can't be, it must matter. Am I wrong to think that it's weird to say that? Isn't it our top on that he says that? If we think about knowledge in the standard ways.
If by standard way you mean sort of a solipsistic account, I don't think that's Plato's view either, but
no. But
it's also not a lot of contemporary epistemologists' view either.
No, but if you think that we can account for knowledge in terms of our, I can't remember how you put it. You said something just now about external realities, and that may be a condition, but it's not. It can't be all there is to it. If another condition is that we can take an account, and that's part of what he describes as the capacity. Again, the dynasthai, the dunamis words come back and back when is she able to give and take an account? Well, if they can't, we don't say that they know. So
okay, thank you.
I think this will run and run, Gail. We talk about it some more.
Good.
Thank you. Going back to Athens, and the next question will be from Alexander Nehamas.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to admit to something, namely that what you made very clear is that at least the upward path after the cave is communal. And I've always, for whatever reason, I've thought of a single person getting up there and then saying, but it can't be that final version. There's much more to it than that. How do they get it if they just go up themselves? And what you've shown, and to me, to many others may be very well known, to me it's extremely interesting that there is this communal enterprise, which confirms what Miles Bernier said 55 years ago, but 2 months. Namely, he described Plato's logos-ridden epistemology,
yes,
which is, I thought, a
yes.
very good.
Yes.
My question is, I agree with all of that. How does the bloody thing start? Especially since we are told that somebody gets liberated because of their own nature. Do you have little Socrates going around telling those guys, or is it some that just get out by themselves and then they find a guru?
It's very interesting because actually the first move is just explained in the passage. So imagine if he's released. She doesn't turn up until the next phase.
Exactly.
But what I was inviting us to think is that she does it, and but I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah,
I don't know I mean, I think it. But so one of the grammatical patterns I was pointing to is the way in which, in a lot of these passages, he uses an impersonal, and then he uses the personal and plays with these pronouns and the numbers of the verbs. And I think I want to say the same about this, but actually when imagine that he's released. So how should we think about him when he's released? Well, then we think about that, and then we realise there's somebody else, and then we go back and ask exactly this question. What was it that happened? Was it is she Mrs. Socrates who comes along and goes, "Oi, I've got a lock, I've got a key that will unlock your chains." It seems to me that it would be very weird to think that Plato didn't think it was a joint enterprise.
What about this? Sorry, John. What about this? Somebody gets liberated because it's their nature to do so. That's very clear.
Right.
And it's once somebody is liberated that he's picked up, so to speak.
Well, so I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I wonder about, because I think two things. One of them is that right from the beginning of book 4, his discussions about the nature of nature are very complicated and circumscribed. So in book 4, 4:23 to 4 thereabouts, he starts by talking about the difference between biological nature and developed nature, second nature, I say. And as he does that, you see that we've got these different versions of what counts as a nature. I wonder, I mean, I've been worrying about this for a while, and I agree with you that Fusé
is very strong, yeah.
Right. So by nature, it's happened to him. So he's sitting there and he goes, "Oh, not really,
Not quite.
He's kind of, the hurly-burly leaves him cold, and then she lets him go." That would be my view of it.
Okay.
And that we see that in retrospect.
Whichever it is, it needs to be cleared up how the process gets started.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think it's interesting that there are a lot of his big words in that little passage. So not just Fusé, but Xanthippe, as well as the anankasdoito, and the anablepe. I mean, there's a whole series of words that are heavily loaded. One of the things about the loading is that they then are polyvalent in lots of ways. They develop a huge, or at least, supposing one takes him seriously in terms of the way he writes. By the time we get to this point, once he uses the word fussis, we're already up there, standing on our own. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, I'm afraid I will misspell it. I apologize for this. Songun Angela, you.
It's Angela.
Hi.
Hiya. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I guess actually this comes off the back of a couple earlier discussions. So one just thought about the atopos discussion back earlier with Ben Morrison. I was wondering whether it's even supposed to be corrective, right? So we say, oh, it's a strange image, such strange prisoners. Yes, and they're like us. Like we are in this atopos place, and we are. So I guess I was wondering if that was the way to go. But to the most recent question of how did this process even get started, I was wondering what you were thinking about the musical education. So I guess the big picture question that I have is I really like this idea of the kind of social aspect of epistemology, let's call it. But there's another kind of social aspect that isn't the giving and receiving logoi together, but maybe the kind of communing with things that are oikeon to us. So of course, this starts off in the very beginning of the dialogue. We start with the very ordinary notion of the people who are oikeon to us, as we see in book 2, or to the guardians or themselves, and like one another and the people in the polis. Then this gets kind of transformed in the myth of the metals to like everyone who ends up being good, because of course we chuck out everyone who's bad via the eugenics. And then kind of at the end, the culmination, the forms end up becoming sunganes to us. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if there's a way in which the communal aspect of epistemology is the reason why we have to be kind of communal with one another, is because being communal with what's oikeon to us is kind of central to how we're supposed to engage with the forms. And we actually get the first move in the musical education. So at 402 A2. So one of my big things is, oh, this is really the rational part. I mean, other people have started to argue for this as well. But, right, the musically educated person is said to, when the logos comes, welcome it, knowing it de oikeoteta, on account of kinship. So if we think that the musical education is kind of like building these kinship relations, there's a way in which you get your first. So if you think that the musical education is building kinship relations such that the musically educated person is going to be akin to well-formed objects, including logoi and eventually the forms. And then if you think that the kinship relation is part of what grounds the epistemological relation to the forms, which we are given, I think, suggestions of, right? The real lover of learning in book 6 is described as grasping the forms with a bit of himself, herself that's fitted to it because it's sungane. Then there's a way in which, I don't know, the whole kind of kinship communal stuff is actually quite important to the activity of communing with the forms. Sorry, that was very long.
No, I get it. I get it. So would this be a way to represent it in the terms that I've been using? That it's all very well my saying that he very carefully draws out the difference between subject and object when he's playing these games with the koinotaphyloan. But that actually what he wants is something, where he would imagine to end up. So this goes back to the question about whether dialectic is at the top or goes all the way through, I think. That he would imagine that there's some kind of there's a kinship, it's kind of all the way through. There's all these subjects and there's all these objects and they're all kind of interconnected. Is that the thought?
Yeah, so this would help explain why dialectic comes at the very end in a way. So what we're trying to do all the way throughout is to cultivate A, the actual kinship relation, and B, a receptivity or sensitivity to the kinship relation, so that you will glom on to the right logoi, right? This is the worry about heuristics and stuff. There are a bunch of logoi that you could have. Some of them are actually very bad and misleading. And so you need a way of being able to kind of, I don't know, sense or have an affinity towards the right logoi that will get you to the forms. And I guess the other part of this thought is something like takoina philon, which I hadn't really thought about before your talk, but which is really interesting, is maybe included in the philon at the end of the day are the forms, right? We are supposed to love them. That's what it is to be a philosopher. And we're supposed to koinonein with the forms. And then there's some koinonia among the forms themselves, question mark, how to interpret that. in book 5. But I think that maybe the if I had to try and distill my ramblings, there is the relationship between the knowers to have the social aspect of epistemology. But I was thinking that there's also a relationship between the knower and the knowns that is less like they're just the stuff and we somehow get access to the stuff, but it's like a one-way street, as it were. Or rather, it's kind of supposed to be a communing, a community type thing.
Right.
With the objects of knowledge.
I mean, that's, so I think I agree with you. I mean, I think everything you said was really interesting, first thing. And I need to go back and think about the music stuff, because he's clearly, so he uses the language of music, playing, it seems to me, on the ways in which words are used in musical theory and the ways in which they're used in politics. So there's a whole series of, if one might call them puns, but wordplay anyway, on the central terms that incorporates enterprises like music, cultural enterprises, and all of those kinds of things.
And more particularly, it seems that the musical education is where the rational element first gets educated, right?
Yeah.
So that would be our first turning. And just one last remark: when the rational nature is first introduced as the philosophical nature in the philosophical dog's bit, the knowledge word there is sunesis. So there's also nice. Communal. Yeah. But anyway, I should stop.
Can I say one more thing though? Because I think one of the other grammatical moves that it seems to me that he makes very often is he, instead of objectivizing and using nouns, he uses verbs. And one of the features of his use of the verb is that it's very often and strikingly imperfective. So that a lot of the time, this too goes back to the question about dialectic, that there's an enormous amount of the verbs. Legein is one of them, perceiving is one. There are all sorts of words in which what you're doing is you're trying to see it clearly, or you're trying to hear it, and a lot of the time, what he's focused on is not the end, not some perfected state, but what it would be like to be in the imperfective state and to try and progress through it. And I think this goes back to Alexander's question, that puts pressure on him to explain how the imperfect, how the trying even gets started. And one of the answers that goes with, interestingly, with the question of music and broader culture is that in the first place, you're actually just subject to it. You don't do anything with it. You're not trying at it. It just sort of comes at you. And one of his moves, I think, is to begin to make us see what it would be to be a subject who wishes to get better at something. And I think, that goes partly to the Fusset question, but it also goes to the music question, because it's true that in the city that the prisoners might be imagined to live in, they're not just doing prizes and stuff, there's culture, there's theatre, there's music. So things are happening to them that engage them all the time. And I think that may be also one of the ways of thinking about the beginning of the process rather than the end. I think the end is always going to be sort of slightly mad, because he's got some really rather strange ideas, but the beginning is what we need to know about.
Okay, so it's 7 minutes past 8, so we can stop. No, it's fine. We can stop here. Thank you very much again for your talk. It was very interesting. And thank you all for participating here in Athens and in Zoom. So the next talk will be in November 19th by me. And a subject, it is titled Between Being and Not Being in Republic 5, the last pages of Republic 5. Hope to see you all there. So have a nice day or have a nice night.
Yeah. I know, isn't it weird?
I understand.
Well, that's the, I mean, sorry. It's one of the